Eleanor Morgan unlocked the front door of her small bookstore as the morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street in Oak Ridge, California. At 58, her hands showed the signs of years spent carefully handling delicate book spines and turning yellowed pages. Today, she was especially excited about a rare first edition of Pride and Prejudice that had arrived the previous day. The bell above the door jingled as she flipped the closed sign to open. Morgan's rare books wasn't a big moneymaker, but it kept her independent, something she'd fought hard for since her divorce 25 years ago. Eleanor carefully arranged the new acquisition in the display case when her best friend Martha bustled in carrying 2 coffee cups. "Morning, Ellie. Brought your favorite vanilla latte, extra hot," Martha said, placing the cup on the counter. Eleanor smiled gratefully. "You're a lifesaver. I was up late last night with the girls. The weekly dinner. How are those gorgeous daughters of yours?" Martha asked, settling into her usual chair by the window. "Thriving, thankfully. Sophia just won a big case, something about elder rights. Olivia's juggling hospital shifts but loving it. And Emma." Eleanor beamed with pride. Her artwork is finally getting noticed. A gallery in San Francisco wants to feature her paintings next month. 3 successful daughters, all from one tiny apartment with a single mom working 2 jobs. "You should write a book about it," Martha said, raising her cup in a toast. Eleanor shook her head. "Just did what any mother would do." "Not any mother, Ellie. Most mothers have help." A customer entered, interrupting their conversation. As Eleanor helped the elderly man find a particular edition of Hemingway, Martha flipped through the local newspaper. When the customer left, Martha looked up. "Did you hear about the big bash Jackson Reynolds is throwing for his 60th? It's all anyone's talking about." Eleanor's hand froze mid-reach for her coffee. She hadn't heard Jackson's name spoken aloud in months. "No," she said quietly. "I don't keep up with his celebrations. Apparently, he's flying in celebrities from Los Angeles. His young wife Victoria, right, is organizing everything. The whole town's buzzing about who's invited and who's not." Eleanor nodded absently, her mind drifting to unwelcome memories. Jackson Reynolds, now a real estate tycoon worth billions, was once her husband and the father of her triplet daughters. A man who had walked away when she was pregnant, claiming he wasn't ready for 1 child, let alone 3. Earth to Eleanor, Martha waved. "You went somewhere else for a minute there." "Sorry," Eleanor said, tucking a strand of gray-streaked brown hair behind her ear. "Just thinking about tomorrow's inventory." After Martha left, Eleanor found herself alone during a quiet moment in the store. She reached behind the counter for a book she was repairing. As she opened it, a faded photograph slipped out. One she'd forgotten was tucked inside. Young Eleanor, barely 32, smiling beside a handsome Jackson. They looked happy, unaware that within months, their marriage would crumble. Eleanor stared at the photo, momentarily allowing herself to imagine a different life. What if Jackson had stayed? What if he had chosen his family over his ambitions? What if her girls had grown up with a father? With a small shake of her head, Eleanor slipped the photo back into the book. "Some choices define an entire lifetime," she whispered to the empty store, "and mine was worth every sacrifice." She closed the book firmly, returning it to its shelf. Her daughters were her triumph, 3 brilliant, compassionate women who had never needed Jackson Reynolds' money or name to succeed. Whatever emptiness Eleanor had felt over the years, her daughters had filled it threefold. The bell above the door jingled again, bringing Eleanor back to the present. Another customer. Another book to find. Another day of the quiet life she had built from the ashes of rejection and heartbreak. The next morning started like any other for Eleanor. She watered the small herb garden on her back porch, savoring the aroma of basil and mint in the morning air. These quiet moments had become her sanctuary over the years. The doorbell's unexpected ring startled her. On her doorstep stood a young man in a crisp uniform, holding a gold envelope. "Eleanor Morgan?" he asked. "Yes, that's me," she replied cautiously. "Special delivery. Signature required." He handed her a digital pad to sign. Eleanor brought the envelope inside, examining its heavy gold paper and embossed lettering. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was an ornate invitation to Jackson Reynolds' 60th birthday celebration at his Oak Ridge Hills mansion, 2 weeks from Saturday. What made her breath catch was the handwritten note beneath the formal invitation: "Eleanor, we need to correct certain mistakes from the past. Your presence is more than welcome, it's necessary. Jackson." Eleanor sank into her kitchen chair. 25 years of silence, and now this? She read the note again, trying to decipher any hidden meaning behind the carefully chosen words. She was still staring at the invitation when her phone rang. It was Martha. "Are you sitting down?" Eleanor asked when she answered. "What happened?" "I just received a gold-embossed invitation to Jackson's birthday party." Martha gasped. "You're kidding. What does that man want after all these years?" Before Eleanor could answer, her doorbell rang again. "Someone's at the door. I'll call you back." A stern-looking man in an expensive suit introduced himself as Robert Chambers, attorney at law. "Ms. Morgan, I represent the new owner of the building housing your bookstore. I'm here to deliver this formal notice." Eleanor took the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was an eviction notice giving her 30 days to vacate the premises. The historic building where her bookstore had operated for 2 decades was being converted into a boutique hotel. "This is impossible," Eleanor whispered. "My lease your lease has a clause allowing termination with 30 days notice if the building is sold," Chambers said flatly. "The new owner is exercising that right." "Who's the new owner?" Eleanor asked, though somehow she already knew. "I'm not at liberty to disclose that information," he replied with practiced neutrality. "However, I am authorized to present an offer for your cooperation." He handed her another envelope. "For your goodwill in vacating promptly, without contesting." Eleanor opened it to find a check for an amount that wouldn't even cover 1 month's inventory costs. "This is insulting," she said, handing it back. Chambers shrugged. "Mr. Reynolds thought you might be stubborn. He has other methods planned." After he left, Eleanor called Martha, who rushed over immediately. Eleanor showed her both the invitation and the eviction notice, laid side by side on the kitchen table. "This is no coincidence," Martha said, anger coloring her face. "He's setting you up, Ellie. First, he threatens your livelihood, then invites you to his show of wealth. It's sick. But why now? After all these years?" Martha's eyes narrowed. "Gossip says he and that model wife of his have some kind of bet going. Victoria apparently told everyone you'd never show up, and Jackson guaranteed not only that you would, but that you'd end up begging for help in front of everyone." Eleanor's face flushed with anger. She grabbed the invitation and walked to her fireplace, striking a match. "Good," Martha nodded as the gold paper caught fire. "Don't give that man the satisfaction." Eleanor watched the invitation curl and blacken. 25 years ago, he gave me an ultimatum: him or my babies. I chose my girls without hesitation." Her voice hardened. "He didn't just leave, Martha. He made sure I lost my teaching position at the university. Professional misconduct, he called it. A complete lie that followed me for years." The invitation turned to ash, but the eviction notice remained on the table, a ticking clock threatening everything Eleanor had built. Have you ever received an unwelcome surprise from someone from your past that only brought pain? Share in the comments which city you're watching this emotional story from. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any chapter. Sleep eluded Eleanor that night. Every time she closed her eyes, memories flooded back, memories she'd carefully packed away years ago. She remembered the day she discovered she was pregnant with triplets. The ultrasound technician had been so excited, pointing at the screen, 1, 2, 3 heartbeats. Congratulations. Eleanor had practically floated home, imagining Jackson's reaction. They'd been trying for a baby for months. 3 at once seemed like a miracle. But Jackson's face had fallen as she shared the news. 3. We can barely afford one right now, he'd said, pacing their small apartment. His real estate business was just getting started, and money was tight. We'll manage, Eleanor had assured him, placing his hand on her still flat stomach. Together. A week later, he delivered his ultimatum, I can't do this, Eleanor. Not now. Not 3 babies. Fix this, or our marriage is over. Eleanor turned over in bed, the memory still razor-sharp after 25 years. She'd chosen her babies without hesitation. Jackson had moved out that night. What followed was worse. Jackson used his growing connections to spread rumors about her at the university where she taught literature. Suddenly, the department chair was questioning her professional conduct. By the time she was 5 months pregnant, she was unemployed with no references. If not for her father's small pension and Martha's unwavering support, Eleanor didn't know how she would have survived those first months alone, pregnant with triplets, and blacklisted in academic circles. The dawn light was creeping through her curtains when Eleanor finally gave up on sleep. She made tea and sat on her back porch, watching the neighborhood come to life. In a few hours, she would need to open the bookstore. The eviction notice sat on her kitchen counter, a ticking time bomb. Later that morning, Eleanor was surprised when all 3 of her daughters arrived at the bookstore for an impromptu lunch visit. They sometimes came individually, but rarely all together on a weekday. Mom, you look exhausted, Olivia said, her doctor's eyes quickly assessing Eleanor's condition. Are you sleeping okay? Just a restless night, Eleanor smiled, embracing each daughter. What a wonderful surprise to see all of you. They'd brought lunch from Eleanor's favorite deli. As they ate in the small back room of the store, Sophia noticed her mother's distraction. Mom, what's wrong? You keep zoning out. Eleanor considered telling them about the invitation and eviction notice but stopped herself. Her daughters had their own busy lives. Besides, they'd never known the full extent of Jackson's cruelty. She'd always protected them from that truth. Just worried about some new inventory issues, she lied. Nothing serious. Emma, always the most intuitive of the triplets, gave her mother a skeptical look. You sure that's all? You seem really preoccupied. I'm fine, really, Eleanor insisted. Tell me more about your upcoming exhibition, Emma. The conversation shifted, but Eleanor noticed her daughters exchanging concerned glances. They knew her too well. After they left, Eleanor found herself staring at old photographs in the small apartment above her shop. The early years had been so difficult, feeding 3 babies on a tight budget, sleepless nights, the constant fear of not being enough. But there had also been indescribable joy, their first smiles, first steps, first words. She'd never regretted her choice, not for a moment. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, she wondered what Jackson had told himself all these years to justify his abandonment. Did he ever think about the 3 daughters he'd never known? Did he feel any remorse for destroying her career? The invitation's ashes still sat in her fireplace. Eleanor had no intention of giving Jackson the satisfaction of seeing her at his party. Whatever mistakes he wanted to correct after 25 years couldn't possibly make up for what he'd done. Yet a small, traitorous part of her wondered what would happen if she did go. Would he apologize? Offer some explanation? Try to make amends? Or was Martha right? Was this all just a cruel game designed to humiliate her further? Eleanor closed the photo album firmly. No. She wouldn't fall into whatever trap Jackson was setting. She had her dignity, her daughters, and her bookstore, at least for now. She needed to focus on finding a new location before the 30 days were up, not waste energy on old wounds that had never properly healed. The weight of the eviction notice and Jackson's invitation pressed on Eleanor's mind for days. Saturday morning, she found herself driving to Oak Ridge Cemetery with a small bouquet of daisies and forget-me-nots, her father's favorite flowers. George Morgan's grave was simple but well-maintained. Eleanor had visited monthly since his passing 10 years ago. Today, she needed his wisdom more than ever. She placed the flowers against the headstone and sat on the small bench she'd installed years ago. "Hi, Dad," she said quietly. "I could really use your advice right now." The gentle breeze rustled the cemetery's maple trees as Eleanor told her father about Jackson's invitation and the eviction notice. She knew he couldn't answer, but speaking aloud helped clarify her thoughts. "I don't know what game Jackson's playing," she sighed. "After 25 years of silence, why reach out now? And why threaten my livelihood at the same time?" Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering the day she told her father about her pregnancy and Jackson's ultimatum. Unlike her mother, who had warned her about marrying Jackson in the first place, George had simply hugged her and said, "You're stronger than you know, Ellie girl." When Eleanor lost her teaching position, it was George who helped her make rent and buy baby supplies with his modest pension. "This isn't charity," he'd insisted. "It's what family does." Most importantly, it was George who reminded her daily that she had made the right choice. "Real power isn't having money," he told her while holding one of the newborn triplets. "Real power is having the courage to face your fears when everyone expects you to crumble." A memory surfaced: Eleanor 8 months pregnant, sobbing on her father's couch after another failed job interview. Her father had knelt despite his bad knees and held her hands. "Eleanor Jean Morgan, listen to me," he'd said firmly. "That man took away your job, but he can't take your dignity unless you let him. Every time you choose courage over fear, you win. Remember that." Eleanor opened her eyes, suddenly certain her father would have advised her to face Jackson rather than hide. Not for Jackson's sake, but for her own closure and perhaps for her daughters, who had their own unresolved questions about their father. As she drove back to town, Eleanor felt lighter somehow. She still hadn't decided what to do about the invitation, but the paralyzing fear had subsided. She stopped by Martha's house on the way home. Her friend answered the door in gardening clothes, soil smudging her cheek. "Perfect timing," Martha said. "I just made lemonade." They sat on Martha's porch, watching hummingbirds dart around the feeder. Eleanor recounted her cemetery visit and the clarity she'd found there. "So you're considering going to the party?" Martha asked, surprised. "I'm considering it," Eleanor admitted. "Not for Jackson, but for myself. Maybe for the girls too. There are questions that have hung over us for 25 years. Martha set down her glass. "If you go, you can't go looking like you're desperate or defeated. That's exactly what he wants." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Martha said with a spark in her eye, "if you're going to face that man on his territory, you need armor." She led Eleanor to her bedroom and opened her closet. "Remember that navy blue dress I bought for my daughter's wedding? The one that was too small?" She pulled out a stunning dress with a modest neckline and 3/4 sleeves. "It's exactly your size." Eleanor touched the fabric hesitantly. "Martha, I couldn't try it on," Martha insisted. The dress fit perfectly, highlighting Eleanor's still elegant figure and bringing out the blue in her eyes. Looking in the mirror, Eleanor saw not the exhausted bookstore owner, but a dignified woman with steel in her spine. "Now that," Martha said with satisfaction, "is how you face down a billionaire ex-husband." "I still haven't decided if I'm going," Eleanor reminded her. "But if you do," Martha countered, "you'll be ready." As Eleanor drove home with the dress carefully hung in her back seat, she thought about her father's words again. "Every time you choose courage over fear, you win." Jackson had taken so much from her: her marriage, her career, her financial security. But he hadn't broken her. She had raised 3 remarkable daughters, built a business, created a life filled with love and meaning. Perhaps it was time to show him exactly what he had walked away from. Not out of spite, but as an affirmation of her own journey and maybe, just maybe, as a first step toward answering the questions her daughters had never dared to ask. Eleanor prepared dinner with extra care that evening. Her weekly meals with her daughters were sacred. A tradition started when the girls left for college. Tonight, she needed their company more than ever. She'd made their favorite comfort food, her grandmother's lasagna recipe, garlic bread, and a fresh salad. As she set the table, Eleanor wrestled with whether to tell them about Jackson's invitation and the eviction notice. The triplets arrived together, each bringing something to share. Sophia brought a bottle of wine, Olivia brought dessert, and Emma brought fresh flowers. Their synchronicity still amazed Eleanor sometimes, despite their different personalities. "Something smells amazing," Sophia said, kissing her mother's cheek. Once they settled at the dinner table, the conversation flowed naturally. Sophia talked about her latest legal case, Olivia described a challenging patient, and Emma shared updates about her gallery preparations. Eleanor watched them, her heart full. They had her eyes, but their features, the shape of their jaw, their high cheekbones, those came from Jackson. She'd never told them how seeing those familiar features had both comforted and pained her over the years. "Mom." Olivia's voice broke into her thoughts. "You're a million miles away." Eleanor took a deep breath. "There's something I need to tell you all." The triplets exchanged glances, instantly alert. "I received an invitation to your father's 60th birthday party." Eleanor's voice was steady as she continued, "And on the same day, I got an eviction notice for the bookstore. The building's been sold, apparently to be turned into a hotel." Silence fell across the table. Sophia was the first to react, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "This can't be a coincidence," she said, her voice tight with anger. "That monster wants to complete what he started 25 years ago. He wants to see us on the street." Olivia, normally the calmest, had tears of anger in her eyes. "During my medical residency, I treated an elderly patient who was a tenant in one of his buildings. She died after he cut the heating in winter to force her out." Emma, always observant, added quietly. "Isn't it interesting this happens right when my art exhibition is getting national attention? He must be furious we've accomplished anything without his precious name or money." Eleanor was startled by their vehemence. "I didn't realize you all felt so strongly about him." "How could we not?" Sophia said. "He abandoned you, abandoned us before we were even born." The conversation intensified as darkness fell outside. Eleanor lit candles as the triplets shared something they'd never revealed before. Each had secretly tried to contact Jackson during their teenage years. "I went to his office when I was 16, Sophia admitted. "His secretary treated me like I was running a scam. She said he had a file with newspaper clippings about us but explicit instructions never to allow contact." Eleanor gasped. "He's been keeping tabs on you all this time?" "Apparently," Emma said. "I wrote him when I got my first art scholarship." No response. "I called his office when I got into medical school," Olivia added. "His assistant said he was permanently unavailable to me." Eleanor felt a surge of protective anger. "Why didn't you tell me about these attempts?" "We didn't want to hurt you," Olivia explained gently. "You worked so hard to give us everything. And we didn't want you to think we were ungrateful or that we needed him," Emma added. Sophia reached for her mother's hand. "But now I'm thinking if he's really been monitoring us from afar all these years, maybe there's more to this invitation than just humiliating you." The night grew late as they discussed possibilities. Why would Jackson suddenly want contact? Was the eviction notice a pressure tactic? What game was he playing? Finally, Emma asked the question they'd been circling, "Mom, are you going to go?" Eleanor looked at the 3 young women she'd raised alone, her greatest achievement, her reason for everything. The decision crystallized in her mind. Yes, she said firmly. Not for Jackson, but for us. For closure. For answers. Sophia's eyes gleamed with determination. Then we're coming with you. Absolutely not, Eleanor protested. This is between Jackson and me. No, Mom, Olivia said gently. It's between Jackson and all of us. We're a package deal, always have been. He's never seen us as adults, Emma added. Never faced what he walked away from. Eleanor recognized the stubborn set of their jaws, the same expression she saw in the mirror when she'd made up her mind. 25 years ago, she'd crossed a threshold when she chose these 3 lives over her marriage. Now, they would cross another threshold together. All right, she conceded. We'll face him as a family. The decision hung in the air, terrifying and empowering. There was no turning back now. The morning after their decision, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table staring at the phone. Calling to accept the invitation felt like surrendering something precious. Her finger hovered over the number printed on the invitation she'd retrieved from the fireplace chart, but still legible. Just do it, Mom, Sophia said, appearing in the doorway in borrowed pajamas. All 3 girls had stayed overnight, something they hadn't done in years. Eleanor nodded and dialed. After 2 rings, a crisp professional voice answered, Reynolds' residence. This is Eleanor Morgan, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm calling about the invitation to Mr. Reynolds' birthday celebration. A pause. One moment, please, Ms. Morgan. Eleanor waited, heart pounding. Her daughters gathered around, offering silent support. Ms. Morgan. The voice returned, noticeably warmer. Mr. Reynolds will be delighted to hear you've accepted. We'll add you to the guest list. The event begins at 7 p.m. Will you be bringing a guest? 3, actually, Eleanor replied. My daughters would like to attend as well. Another, longer pause. I'll need to check with Mr. Reynolds about additional guests. That won't be necessary, Eleanor said firmly. They're his daughters too. If he wants me there, they come as part of the package. The silence stretched uncomfortably before the assistant finally responded. I'll update the guest list, Ms. Morgan. For attendees. Thank you for calling. Eleanor hung up, hands shaking slightly. It's done. You were amazing, Emma said, squeezing her mother's shoulders. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nervous energy. The triplets left for their respective jobs, promising to meet later in the week to plan their strategy for the party. Eleanor opened the bookstore, trying to focus on normal tasks despite the countdown ticking in her mind. Around noon, the bell over the door jingled. Eleanor looked up to see a man in an expensive suit, different from the lawyer who delivered the eviction notice, but cut from the same cloth. Ms. Morgan, he said with a practiced smile. I'm David Wells, representing Oak Ridge Development Corporation. Eleanor's defenses immediately rose. What can I do for you, Mr. Wells? I understand you've received notice regarding your lease, he said smoothly. I'm here to discuss an amenable solution. Eleanor crossed her arms. I'm listening. Wells placed a folder on the counter. We're prepared to offer compensation for your immediate vacancy. No need to wait the full 30 days. Eleanor opened the folder to find a check for an amount that might cover 1 month's expenses, barely more than the previous insulting offer. This is meant to ease your transition, Wells continued. A gesture of goodwill. Goodwill would be allowing me to stay until I find a suitable new location, Eleanor countered. Wells's smile tightened. I'm afraid that's not possible. The new owner has a strict timeline for renovations. And who is this new owner? Eleanor asked directly. I'm not at liberty to disclose that information. Eleanor handed the folder back. Then I'm not at liberty to accept this offer. I'll use the full 30 days I'm legally entitled to. Wells's friendly demeanor faltered. Ms. Morgan, Mr. Reynolds suggested you might be difficult. He instructed me to inform you that he has other methods if you refuse to cooperate. There it was confirmation of what she had suspected. Is that a threat, Mr. Wells? Simply a reality check, he replied, retrieving the folder. Good day, Ms. Morgan. After he left, Eleanor called Martha, who arrived within minutes. First the invitation, now this. Martha fumed after hearing about Wells's visit. He's trying to squeeze you from all sides. Eleanor nodded grimly. And it's only getting started. The next morning brought another unwelcome surprise. Health inspectors arrived for an anonymous complaint about potential code violations. They scrutinized every corner of the bookstore while Eleanor watched helplessly. Though they found nothing significant, their presence deterred customers all morning. Eleanor noticed people glancing in the window and then moving on, unwilling to enter a business under official inspection. By the time they left, the damage was done. Eleanor stood at her window, watching people cross the street to avoid her store. This is just the beginning, isn't it? She asked Martha when her friend stopped by with lunch. He's testing you, Martha agreed, unpacking sandwiches. Seeing if you'll break before the party. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. Well, I survived raising triplets on a bookstore salary. I can survive Jackson Reynolds's intimidation tactics. That evening, Martha helped Eleanor try on the navy dress again. You need to look perfect, confident but not trying too hard. Eleanor studied her reflection. The woman looking back wasn't the broken-hearted young Professor Jackson had abandoned, but someone stronger, tempered by years of struggle and triumph. Let him play his games, Eleanor said quietly. He doesn't know who he's dealing with anymore. Martha smiled. Adjusting the dress's neckline. That's my girl. Now we just need to get through the next 2 weeks without him burning down your store or something equally dramatic. Eleanor laughed despite herself. At this point, nothing would surprise me. But even as she joked, Eleanor wondered what other tests Jackson had planned before the confrontation. Whatever came, she would face it not just for herself, but for the 3 daughters who had become her unexpected allies in this battle with the past. Eleanor was restocking a display of first editions when the shop door opened, bringing in a burst of chatter and expensive perfume. She turned to see a striking blonde woman in her early 30s, followed by 3 equally polished friends. Even without introductions, Eleanor knew immediately who she was facing. Victoria Reynolds glided through the shop like she owned it, which, Eleanor realized grimly, her husband might soon. The young woman's beauty was undeniable, flawless skin, expertly styled hair, designer clothes that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly rent. Victoria's friends spread out, picking up books and putting them down in the wrong places, speaking loudly as if Eleanor weren't present. Can you believe people still read actual books? One said with a theatrical whisper. So quaint. I wonder how much longer this place will be here, another replied, not bothering to lower her voice. I heard the whole block is being redeveloped. Eleanor maintained her composure, continuing to arrange her display. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of appearing bothered. Victoria approached the counter, removing her designer sunglasses. Up close, Eleanor could see the calculating intelligence behind her perfect features. You must be Eleanor, Victoria said, her voice honey-sweet with an undercurrent of acid. I've heard so much about you. Welcome to Morgan's Rare Books, Eleanor replied evenly. Can I help you find something? Victoria smiled, all perfect white teeth. Just browsing. Jackson mentioned this place was significant. She glanced around dismissively. Though I must say, it's smaller than I expected. Sometimes the most precious things come in modest packages, Eleanor responded, meeting Victoria's gaze directly. Victoria's smile tightened. Jackson told me everything about you, you know. The desperate teacher who tried to trap him with a pregnancy. She leaned in, dropping her voice. I can imagine how difficult it must be for you to see him happy and successful after all these years. Eleanor felt a flash of anger but kept her expression neutral. Difficult would be having to live with his conscience. Fortunately, I only have to live with mine. Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, surprise, perhaps even a hint of respect. She hadn't expected Eleanor to stand her ground. We're so looking forward to seeing you at the party, Victoria continued, adjusting her strategy. Jackson has been quite preoccupied since sending your invitation. It's all rather mysterious. I'm sure it is, Eleanor replied, unwilling to give Victoria any information. Will you be coming alone? I instructed the party planner to seat you at one of the outer tables. We wouldn't want you to feel uncomfortable among all those successful people. Before Eleanor could respond, the shop door opened and Martha walked in, immediately assessing the situation. Eleanor, I brought that book valuation you asked for, she announced, placing herself protectively beside her friend. Victoria straightened, recognizing the reinforcement. Well, we should be going. So many preparations for the big night. She gestured to her friends. Do come, Eleanor. Jackson's birthday wouldn't be complete without his past. After they left, Eleanor released a shaky breath. That was Jackson's wife. I figured, Martha said, watching through the window as the women climbed into a luxury SUV. You handled her beautifully. She wanted to rattle me, Eleanor said. But something was off. She seemed worried. Maybe trouble in paradise? Martha suggested. You stood your ground, Ellie. I think you even impressed her. Later that evening, Eleanor told her daughters about Victoria's visit during their video call. She was marking her territory, Sophia said. Classic intimidation tactic. But why? Olivia wondered. If Jackson's motivation is to humiliate Mom, wouldn't Victoria be confident, not defensive? Unless, Emma said thoughtfully, Jackson's reasons for inviting Mom aren't what Victoria thinks. After the call ended, Sophia remained in her downtown apartment, staring at her laptop. Her sisters didn't know that she'd been discreetly investigating their father for weeks. A colleague at the prosecutor's office had tipped her off. Jackson Reynolds was under federal investigation for tax fraud and money laundering. The case was sealed, but rumors suggested it was substantial. Sophia dialed her sisters for an emergency private call, one their mother wasn't part of. I've discovered something about Dad, she said when they answered. He's being investigated for serious financial crimes. Tax fraud? Olivia asked, her medical mind quickly connecting dots. And money laundering, Sophia confirmed. The case is under seal, but my contact says it's significant. Emma's artistic intuition kicked in. What if the invitation has something to do with this? What if he's trying to create a family reconciliation story to appear more sympathetic for a jury? That's exactly what I'm thinking, Sophia agreed. We need to protect Mom. This could be much bigger than a petty attempt to humiliate her. The sisters agreed to meet in person the next day to develop a strategy. Whatever game Jackson was playing, they would be ready. Have you ever faced someone who tried to diminish your dignity? How did you react? Share your experience in the comments and subscribe to discover how Eleanor and her daughters plan to face this impossible situation. With only 3 days left until Jackson's party, tension hung in the air like an approaching storm. Eleanor had survived a week of subtle harassment, more inspections, cancelled deliveries, and a sudden problem with the bookstore's water supply that took 2 days to resolve. What she didn't know was that her daughters were engaged in their own secret preparations. In Emma's art studio, the triplets gathered around a clothing rack holding 3 identical red dresses. Are you sure about this? Olivia asked, touching the silky fabric. It seems a bit dramatic. Sophia grinned. Dramatic is exactly what we need. When we walk into that party looking exactly alike, it'll throw him completely off balance. Emma nodded, adjusting the hemline on one dress. We've always used our identical appearance as a fun party trick. This time, we're using it as strategy. The sisters had spent their childhoods perfecting the art of twin switching, though in their case, it was triplet switching. They could mimic each other's mannerisms flawlessly when they wanted to, a skill that had gotten them through many tough situations growing up. "I still think we should tell Mom," Olivia said, always the most cautious of the three. "We will," Sophia assured her. "Just not until right before the party. You know she'll try to talk us out of it." Emma held up small, discreet recording devices. "I've got these ready too. If he says anything incriminating, we'll have evidence." Meanwhile, Eleanor was at home, trying on Martha's navy dress again, fighting waves of doubt. The phone rang, providing a welcome distraction. "Eleanor?" "It's Gladys from the book club," said the familiar voice of one of her regular customers. "I'm calling to check if you're okay." "I'm fine, why?" "Well, there's a rumor going around town that your store is being shut down because of health violations. Several people said they were warned not to shop there." Eleanor gripped the phone tighter. "That's absolutely false. We had an inspection, but there were no violations." "Who's spreading these rumors?" "I'm not sure," Gladys hesitated. "But I overheard Victoria Reynolds talking about it at the salon yesterday." After thanking Gladys, Eleanor sat heavily on her bed. The dress pooled around her like a protective shell. She shouldn't be surprised by these tactics, but the cruelty still stung. The doorbell rang. Eleanor quickly changed and went downstairs to find Martha on her porch, looking unusually solemn. "What's wrong?" Eleanor asked, ushering her inside. Martha opened her purse and pulled out a small velvet box. "I want you to wear this to the party." Inside was a beautiful sapphire brooch set in silver. "Martha, I couldn't dash, it was my grandmother's," Martha interrupted. "She wore it when she testified against the factory owner who caused her husband's death. She said it gave her courage." Martha pinned the brooch to Eleanor's blouse. "Consider it armor. And a reminder that you have people who truly care about you." Eleanor hugged her friend tightly, fighting tears. "What would I do without you?" "Thankfully, you'll never have to find out," Martha replied firmly. The next morning, Eleanor arrived at her store to find a manila envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a thick document labeled "Settlement Agreement," offering a slightly larger amount for her immediate departure from the bookstore. Eleanor set it aside, refusing to be distracted by another ploy. Hours later, she was surprised when all three of her daughters showed up together, carrying garment bags. "We need to talk, Mom," Sophia said as they followed Eleanor to her apartment above the store. Eleanor's heart sank when she saw their serious expressions. "What's happened?" Emma unzipped the garment bags, revealing 3 identical red dresses. "What are those for?" Eleanor asked, though she was beginning to suspect. "For the party," Olivia explained gently. "We're going to attend looking exactly alike." "Absolutely not," Eleanor protested. "This is already complicated enough without Mom," Sophia interrupted. "He's been monitoring us from afar our whole lives but has never had to face us. This is our chance to make him see what he walked away from." "It's too risky," Eleanor insisted. "Jackson is vindictive. You've seen what he's doing to the bookstore. If he realizes what you're planning, what can he do, Mom?" Emma asked. "Disown us? He did that before we were born." Eleanor paced the small living room, anxiety building. "You don't understand how manipulative he can be." "We understand more than you think," Sophia said carefully. "We've been doing our research." The sisters exchanged glances before Olivia continued. "We know about the federal investigation into his business dealings." Eleanor stopped pacing. "What investigation?" Sophia explained what she'd learned about the tax fraud and money laundering allegations, watching her mother's expression shift from surprise to understanding. "You think that's why he invited me? To create a sympathetic family narrative for a potential jury?" "It makes sense," Emma said. "The timing, the sudden interest in reconnecting, even the aggression toward the bookstore. He's desperate and flailing. Eleanor sat down, processing this new information. And the matching dresses? Psychological impact, Sophia explained. We'll be a united front, 4 women he wronged instead of just one. Plus, he won't be able to tell us apart, which gives us a tactical advantage. Looking at her daughter's determined faces, Eleanor recognized her own stubbornness reflected back at her. They were no longer the little girls she'd protected all their lives. They were strong, intelligent women ready to fight their own battles. When did you all grow up to be so formidable? She asked softly. We had a good teacher, Olivia replied, taking her mother's hand. Eleanor looked at the 3 identical dresses and felt a shift in her perspective. Perhaps this wasn't just her battle to face the past, but theirs too. Maybe, by standing together, they could all find the closure they needed. All right, she finally agreed. But we stick together the entire time. No one confronts Jackson alone. The triplets nodded in unison, their expressions a mixture of determination and relief. Whatever awaited them at Jackson Reynolds' birthday party, they would face it as a family, the family he had rejected, but that had thrived despite his absence. The day of Jackson's party arrived with an unseasonable chill in the air. Eleanor woke early, her dreams filled with fragments of the past. Jackson's smile when they first met, his voice when he'd asked her to marry him, his cold eyes when he'd walked out. She made tea and sat on her back porch, watching the sun rise. In 12 hours, she would be face to face with the man who had shaped so much of her life through his absence. The thought made her stomach knot with anxiety. The bookstore remained closed for the day, a small act of self-care Eleanor had allowed herself. At noon, Martha arrived with lunch and a steadying presence. Having second thoughts? Martha asked, noticing Eleanor's distraction. About 1,000 of them, Eleanor admitted. Part of me still wants to call the whole thing off. Martha squeezed her hand. That's your fear talking. Remember what your father always said about facing your fears. Eleanor nodded, drawing strength from the memory of her father's wisdom. The girls will be here at 4. We're getting ready together. By late afternoon, Eleanor's small apartment buzzed with nervous energy as the triplets arrived with makeup bags, hair tools, and their identical red dresses. They took turns in the bathroom, helping each other prepare. I still can't believe we're doing this, Olivia said as Emma applied her makeup to match her sister's exactly. Believe it, Sophia replied, adjusting her hair. By tonight, Jackson Reynolds will finally have to face all 4 of us. Eleanor watched her daughters transform into perfect copies of each other, a sight both unsettling and oddly powerful. In their matching red dresses with identical hairstyles and makeup, they were a force, 3 aspects of the same formidable presence. When Eleanor emerged in Martha's navy dress with the sapphire brooch pinned at her neckline, the triplets fell silent. Mom, Emma whispered, you look beautiful. Eleanor smoothed the fabric nervously. I feel like I'm putting on armor for battle. In a way, you are, Sophia said. But remember, you're not fighting alone. As evening approached, they gathered in Eleanor's living room for a final review of their plan. Sophia distributed the small recording devices, showing her sisters and mother how to activate them discreetly. We stay together, Eleanor reminded them. No one gets isolated. The triplets nodded in unison, an effect made more striking by their identical appearance. Jackson won't know what hit him, Emma said with grim satisfaction. The drive to Oak Ridge Hills was tense and mostly silent. Eleanor's modest sedan seemed increasingly out of place as they approached the wealthy neighborhood where Jackson lived. The contrast between her life and his had never been more stark than in this moment, her practical family car versus the parade of luxury vehicles they began to encounter. As they turned onto Jackson Street, the mansion came into view, brilliantly lit against the darkening sky. Floodlights illuminated the expansive property, and valets in uniform directed the arriving vehicles. My God, Olivia breathed. It's like a castle. Eleanor felt a painful twinge. While she had struggled to pay for the triplets' school supplies, Jackson had accumulated grotesque wealth. While she'd worked overtime to afford their braces, he'd built this monument to excess. "Are you okay, Mom?" Sophia asked, noticing her expression. "Yes," Eleanor said firmly. "Just thinking about what might have been versus what is. And honestly, I wouldn't trade my life with you three for all of this." They joined the line of cars approaching the circular driveway. Luxury vehicles surrounded them: Bentleys, Mercedes, even a Rolls-Royce. Eleanor's 10-year-old sedan stuck out like a sore thumb. When they reached the front, a young valet approached, barely concealing his disdain for their vehicle. His expression changed dramatically when four elegantly dressed women emerged, one dignified in navy blue, and three identical women in striking red. "Good evening," Eleanor said, handing him her keys with more confidence than she felt. "We're here for Jackson Reynolds' birthday celebration." The valet stammered a response, his eyes darting between the triplets in confusion. As they approached the entrance, a security guard checked a tablet. "Name, please." "Eleanor Morgan. Plus 3 guests." The guard's eyebrows rose as he looked up, taking in the triplets. You're on the list. Welcome to the Reynolds residence." They entered a soaring marble foyer filled with guests in formal attire, many already holding champagne flutes. Conversations hummed around them, but as they moved further into the space, a strange phenomenon occurred: voices quieted, heads turned, and whispers spread. Eleanor felt a mixture of anxiety and determination as they approached the main ballroom. Through the wide doorway, she could see hundreds of guests mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. Ice sculptures glittered on buffet tables laden with gourmet food. An orchestra played in one corner. And there, in the center of it all, stood Jackson Reynolds, still handsome at 60, laughing with a group of men in expensive suits. Beside him, Victoria sparkled in a gold dress that must have cost more than Eleanor's car. "There he is," Emma whispered unnecessarily. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 25 years of absence, hurt, and unanswered questions. They stood at the threshold of the ballroom, 4 women about to walk into the lion's den. "Ready?" Eleanor asked her daughters. The triplets nodded in perfect unison. Together, they stepped forward into the light. A hush fell over the ballroom as Eleanor and her daughters entered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne glasses paused halfway to lips. All eyes turned to the striking quartet: one elegant woman in navy blue followed by 3 identical young women in vibrant red. Victoria noticed the shift in atmosphere first. Her perfect features tightened as she followed the guests' stares. She nudged Jackson, whispering something in his ear. He turned, his confident smile freezing on his face. For a moment, he simply stared, the color draining from his complexion. The crystal tumbler in his hand slipped, shattering on the marble floor. No one moved to clean it up, all attention remained fixed on the unfolding drama. Jackson recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders and whispering something to Victoria. She nodded stiffly, her golden dress catching the light as she moved to intercept a waiter. Jackson began making his way across the room, his stride purposeful but his face betraying his shock. "He looks like he's seen a ghost," Emma murmured. "Or 3. Eleanor felt strangely calm as Jackson approached. The years had been kind to him, his dark hair now silver at the temples, a few distinguished lines around his eyes. He still carried himself with the confidence of a man who believed the world existed to serve him. "Eleanor," he said when he reached them, his voice controlled but with a slight tremor. "You came." His gaze moved from her to the triplets, unable to distinguish one from another. "And you brought company." Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. "How could I refuse such a personal invitation?" "Jackson, Victoria," she nodded to his wife, who had appeared at his side with a frozen smile. "Allow me to introduce Sophia, Olivia, and Emma." A flicker of something: recognition, regret, fear, crossed Jackson's face as he looked at the triplets. "Your daughters have grown up well," he said stiffly, not meeting their eyes. Your mother must have done an excellent job. Sophia stepped forward slightly. She did everything alone, Mr. Reynolds. Absolutely everything. Olivia added with quiet intensity, while you were building your empire, she was building 3 lives. Emma simply observed, taking in every nuance of the father she'd never known. Victoria, clearly struggling to control the situation, extended a manicured hand to the nearest triplet. We're so delighted you could all attend. Jackson has been looking forward to this reunion. The triplet, impossible to tell which, shook her hand with a grip just firm enough to make Victoria wince. Strange, considering he blocked us every time we tried to contact him over the past 25 years. Another triplet added, including when we needed compatible donors during our mother's leukemia treatment. The third finished, fortunately, she survived. Without any help from him. Eleanor swayed slightly at the mention of her illness, a battle she'd fought 5 years ago, trying desperately to shield her daughters from the worst of her fear. They'd discovered the truth anyway, it seemed. Jackson's face showed genuine surprise. Leukemia? I never knew. You never asked, Eleanor said simply. Guests nearby were openly staring now, many whispering behind their hands. Victoria's smile had become a grimace as she realized the carefully choreographed party was spiraling out of her control. This isn't the appropriate time or place for family discussions, Jackson said, lowering his voice. Eleanor, perhaps we could speak privately in my office? He gestured toward a security guard, who began moving in their direction. The implied threat wasn't subtle. One of the triplets, Sophia, based on her decisive step forward, placed herself slightly in front of Eleanor. Our mother isn't going anywhere alone with you. Jackson's jaw tightened with irritation at the public challenge. You don't understand what's at stake here. Victoria intervened with artificial brightness. Why don't we take a family photo? The Reynolds family reunited at last. Before anyone could object, she signaled to a photographer hovering nearby. Just one picture for the occasion. Eleanor recognized the maneuver for what it was, an attempt to transform a potentially embarrassing situation into a controlled narrative. But as she studied Jackson's face, she noticed something concerning beyond his obvious discomfort. His complexion had a grayish undertone, his forehead was beaded with sweat, and his breathing seemed labored. A photo would be lovely, Eleanor said unexpectedly, surprising everyone, including her daughters. But first, I believe Jackson and I do have matters to discuss. She fixed him with a steady gaze. And yes, your office would be appropriate. Victoria started to protest, but Jackson silenced her with a look. The triplets formed a protective formation around Eleanor as they followed Jackson through the crowd of murmuring guests. Many had their phones out, documenting the unexpected family drama. Jackson led them down a hallway lined with expensive artwork to a massive oak door. Inside was a study that screamed power and wealth: leather-bound books, antique desk, oil paintings of landscapes Eleanor recognized from their early courtship. As soon as the door closed behind them, Jackson seemed to deflate, sinking into his chair with a weariness that couldn't be faked. The triplets positioned themselves around Eleanor, still on guard. What game are you playing, Jackson? Eleanor asked directly. The invitation, the eviction notice, the health inspectors. What do you want from us after all this time? Jackson looked up, meeting her eyes with an expression she'd never expected to see on his face: defeat. I'm bankrupt, he said simply. Everything's collapsing: the investigations, the creditors, the partners abandoning ship. In a few weeks, I'll have nothing. The silence that followed Jackson's confession was heavy with disbelief. Eleanor and her daughters exchanged glances, trying to process this unexpected revelation. Sophia, the lawyer, was the first to recover. The tax fraud investigation. That's why you wanted to create a family reconciliation story? To appear more sympathetic to a jury? Jackson laughed bitterly. Perceptive. Just like your mother always was. He turned to Eleanor. You won in the end, didn't you? You raised 3 extraordinary women while I built a house of cards. He opened a desk drawer and removed an envelope. But I can still give them what they never had: my name. Legal recognition. Whatever part of my inheritance I can still salvage. Eleanor, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Why now, Jackson? After all this time? Jackson's face seemed to age before their eyes. I'm dying. Terminal cancer. 6 months at most. He laughed without humor. Ironic, isn't it? Everything I built crumbling just as I'm about to lose the only thing that matters: time. For Eleanor, this moment was a strange validation. For 25 years, she had carried not just the burden of raising the triplets alone, but also the secret doubt: what if she had chosen differently? What if she had given in to Jackson's demands? Now, looking at the broken man before her and the 3 strong women beside her, she knew with absolute certainty that she had made the right choice. I'm sorry about your diagnosis, she said quietly. No one deserves that. One of the triplets, Olivia, Eleanor could tell by the compassionate furrow of her brow despite the identical appearance, asked, How long have you known? 3 months, Jackson replied. Around the same time the federal investigation escalated. Everything's falling apart simultaneously. He gestured toward the window, where guests could be seen mingling in the garden. Victoria doesn't know. Nobody knows. Except the 4 of you now. And this invitation, Eleanor said, piecing things together. You wanted what, exactly? Forgiveness? A chance to make amends before it's too late. Jackson seemed to deflate further. I wanted to see what I threw away. What kind of women my daughters became without me. His voice broke slightly. And yes, perhaps some part of me wanted forgiveness, though I don't deserve it. He turned to the triplets. I can offer you the foundation I created. It's financially separate from my other businesses, one of the few assets that will survive. Originally a tax shelter, but it could do real good in the right hands. The triplets communicated silently with just looks, a talent they'd perfected since childhood. Sophia spoke for them all. We'll accept the recognition not for your benefit, but because it's rightfully ours. As for the foundation, we'll need time to consider that offer. Jackson nodded, accepting their terms. Take all the time you need. Though I don't have much left myself. As they prepared to return to the party, Jackson paused at the door. There's one more thing you should know. The historic building housing your bookstore, I bought it years ago through a shell company. I've always owned it. Eleanor gasped softly. All these years. I couldn't bring myself to evict you, Jackson admitted. But when the investigation began, my lawyers suggested selling assets quickly. I panicked. That still doesn't explain the timing of the eviction notice, Sophia noted, ever the analytical one. Jackson looked away. Victoria discovered I owned the building. She insisted we monetize the asset. She doesn't know our history. I told her you were just a tenant. Outside the office, they could hear the party continuing. Victoria was likely wondering what was taking so long, perhaps already planning her next move. What do we do now? Emma asked as they prepared to return to the party. Jackson straightened his tie, visibly pulling himself together. We go back out there. I'll make some announcement about reconnecting with old friends. Victoria will be furious, but appearances matter tonight. When they re-entered the ballroom, the whispers resumed. Victoria immediately approached, her golden dress shimmering as she moved. There you are, she said with artificial warmth. Everyone's waiting for the birthday toast, darling. Her eyes darted between Jackson and Eleanor, clearly trying to assess what had transpired. The pallor of Jackson's face and the calm confidence in Eleanor's expression told her something had fundamentally changed. Jackson cleared his throat and asked for attention. The orchestra stopped playing, and guests gathered around. Thank you all for coming tonight, he began. Reaching 60 years is a milestone that makes one reflect on life's journey. He gestured toward Eleanor and the triplets. I'm especially grateful to welcome Eleanor Morgan this evening, a woman who should have remained by my side throughout this journey, and these remarkable young women, the daughters I had the privilege to father, but not the wisdom to raise. Audible gasps rippled through the crowd. Victoria's face froze in a mask of shock. The carefully cultivated image of perfect Jackson Reynolds was crumbling before the elite of Oak Ridge. Eleanor, seeing the painful public confession for what it was, perhaps Jackson's first truly selfless act, felt a surprising wave of compassion. She stepped forward and gently touched his arm. "Thank you for your honesty, Jackson," she said quietly. "I think we've all had enough drama for one evening. We should go." As they made their way toward the exit, Eleanor could feel Victoria's eyes boring into her back. The young woman's carefully constructed world was disintegrating, and Eleanor knew from experience how that felt. In the car, driving away from the mansion's glittering lights, Emma broke the tense silence. "What do we do now?" "About him, the foundation, everything." Eleanor glanced in the rearview mirror at her 3 daughters. "That decision is yours to make. You're adults. But remember, true wealth isn't what we possess, but who we become despite the obstacles we face." The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in 25 years, the shadow of Jackson Reynolds no longer darkened their path. 2 months after the dramatic confrontation at Jackson's birthday party, Eleanor sat in the quiet of her bookstore, processing the whirlwind of changes. The eviction notice had been formally withdrawn the very next day. A week later, the deed to the historic building arrived in her name, Jackson's final attempt at making amends. Outside, autumn leaves swirled in the breeze. Eleanor was organizing a display of rare first editions when her phone rang. It was Olivia. "Mom, he's asking for you," she said gently. "The doctors say it's time." Jackson's decline had been swift. The cancer had spread more aggressively than expected, confining him to a hospital bed within weeks of his birthday party. Victoria had disappeared soon after news of his financial troubles became public, reportedly leaving the country with several valuable items. She'd been detained at the airport, another scandal for the gossip mill of Oak Ridge. Eleanor drove to the hospital, her emotions a complex tangle. She'd visited Jackson once before, bringing something she thought he might want to see, a photo album chronicling the triplets' lives. The memories she'd preserved despite his absence. "These are them," she'd said simply, placing the album in his trembling hands. "All the life you missed." Now, as she entered his hospital room, she was struck by how small he looked, this man who had once seemed so powerful, reduced to a fragile figure in a sterile bed. The triplets were already there, each having formed their own tentative relationship with their dying father over the past weeks. "Eleanor," Jackson's voice was barely a whisper. "Thank you for coming." She sat beside his bed, taking in the hollowed cheeks and sunken eyes. "How are you feeling today?" "Like a man getting exactly what he deserves," he replied with a ghost of his old sardonic smile. "The doctors say hours, maybe a day." Eleanor nodded, unsure what to say. Their shared history was too complicated for simple platitudes. "I wanted to tell you," Jackson continued with effort, "watching you with our daughters these past weeks, seeing the women they became because of you, it's been the greatest gift of my life, even if I don't deserve it." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, surprising her. "They are extraordinary women. Not because of me or in spite of you, but because of who they chose to become." Jackson nodded weakly. "I've signed everything over. The foundation, the remaining assets, everything. It's not much compared to what it would have been, but it's something. We didn't come for your money, Jackson. I know. That's why you deserve it." The triplets moved closer, forming a circle around the bed. Each had found their own way to connect with the father they'd never known. Sophia had helped organize his legal affairs, ensuring the foundation's transition would be smooth. Olivia had consulted on his medical care, advocating for better pain management. Emma, in her own way, had shared her artistic perspective, painting a portrait of Jackson not as he was, but as he might have been, a father surrounded by his family. "I have something to ask all of you," Jackson said, his voice strengthening momentarily. "Forgiveness is too much to ask, I know that. But understanding, perhaps. I was young, scared, selfish. I made the worst mistake of my life when I walked away." Eleanor looked at her daughters, seeing in their expressions the complexity of emotions she herself felt: anger and compassion, resentment and pity, the shadow of what might have been alongside acceptance of what was. "The past can't be changed," she said finally. "But it can be accepted. We all make choices, Jackson. Some we regret, some we celebrate. In the end, they make us who we are." Jackson closed his eyes, a single tear tracking down his hollow cheek. "Thank you," he whispered. "For letting me see what I missed. For letting me go with that knowledge. This journey has been an emotional roller coaster, and we want to thank you for coming along with us." Which moment in this story touched your heart the most? Share in the comments, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories that celebrate female strength across generations. You are our inspiration. 3 months later, Eleanor stood on a small stage, cutting a ribbon stretched across the entrance of what had once been simply her bookstore. Now it was the Morgan Reynolds Cultural Center, a transformed space housing not just Eleanor's expanded rare book collection, but also a children's library, a community legal aid office run by Sophia, a free medical clinic overseen by Olivia, and an art gallery curated by Emma. "This isn't just a new chapter for our family," Eleanor told the gathered crowd. "It's a new story altogether, one that we hope will benefit the entire community." The center's first visitors included a surprising number of single mothers, many with children in tow. Martha, now the manager of the center's cafe, whispered to Eleanor during the reception, "The triplets did this. They found these women through the foundation. You've inspired not just your daughters, but an entire generation." In a quiet moment during the celebration, Eleanor found herself alone in the rare books section. She ran her fingers over a first edition of Pride and Prejudice, the book she used to read to the triplets as babies during those cold nights when she couldn't afford heat. A profound sense of fulfillment washed over her, not because of the building or the foundation's money, but because of the certainty that every sacrifice had been worthwhile. Every struggle had led to this moment of creation and community. Martha joined her, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. To the last laugh, she toasted with a knowing smile. Eleanor raised her glass, looking across the room at her daughters engaging with the community they were helping to build. "No," she corrected gently. "To the first chapter of many new stories." The triplets, sensing their mother's gaze, turned simultaneously and smiled at her 3 identical faces with unique expressions, reflecting light differently, just like their lives, born from the same circumstances but flourishing in distinct and wonderful directions. On the wall behind them hung Emma's newest painting, 4 women walking hand in hand toward the light, their shadows joining not as one, but as many paths behind them, representing not just the past they'd overcome, but the countless futures they might create. Beneath the painting, a small plaque read, "Morgan Reynolds Triplets Foundation," because every brave choice creates not just one life, but generations of possibilities. Eleanor smiled. Some journeys end with gold or glory. Hers had ended with something far more precious, a legacy of love, strength, and possibility that would continue long after she was gone.